It happened just after dessert, when the laughter was still lingering and the candles had burned low. Dad, Robert Carter, rose from his chair, cleared his throat, and said in a voice that didn't quite match the warm glow of the room, "After what you've done, Elise, we can't have you here anymore." No one looked at me. Forks clattered awkwardly against plates. Someone shifted in their seat. Maybe Aunt Maggie Dwyer, maybe Trevor. I waited for someone to laugh, to say it was a joke, a misunderstanding, a slip of the tongue. But the only answer was the suitcase by the door. And worse, the empty space on the living room wall where Grandpa's favorite photograph used to hang. The one of him and me standing on the front porch with our fishing rods, smiling like the world had no edges. Gone. Just like that. "We think it's best you go quietly," Maggie added, folding her napkin with sharp, deliberate fingers. "It's better for everyone this way." I stood there, hands trembling, but only slightly, because dignity was the only thing I had left. And then I felt a small hand tug at mine. It was Sophie, my niece, her big brown eyes wide with confusion. "But you didn't mean to hurt anyone, right?" she whispered, her voice small enough that maybe no one else heard. I squeezed her hand once, gently, before someone, probably her mother, pulled her away. No screaming. No pleading, no grand speeches, just the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears as I picked up the suitcase and stepped into the cold night air. Behind me, the door clicked shut. Locked. Final. The stars above were silent witnesses. I left, carrying nothing but a suitcase, and a question that no one dared to answer. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a single text from Sophie. "Stay away. It's bigger than you think." No explanation, no apology. Just a warning that settled into my chest like a stone. I spent that day moving through a world that no longer seemed to fit. The coffee shop I used to visit with Mom, the barista didn't recognize me. The grocery store where Grandpa used to joke about my poor choice in cereal. Nobody smiled back. By afternoon, I made one last mistake. I called Aunt Maggie. I thought maybe there was a version of this story where she would pick up and explain. Instead, the call went straight to voicemail. Blocked. Later that evening, I found myself sitting in my car outside Mom's house, rehearsing what to say. A simple question, nothing more, just, why? When she opened the door, I caught a glimpse inside. The family portrait still hung above the fireplace, but now, a gap where my face had once been. Photos rearranged. History edited with the precision of a scalpel. We stood there, two strangers separated by an open door. "You were always different," Mom said at last, her voice soft, almost rehearsed. "Maybe it's better this way." I didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't cheapen the silence. That night, scrolling through old texts, I noticed something I hadn't before. Trevor had sent a message weeks ago, buried under the flood of family group chats. Not everyone's on their side. No punctuation, no explanation, just enough to keep a spark alive where everything else had gone cold. Someone knew the truth. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they just needed me to find the rest of the story first. The erasure wasn't complete. Not yet. It took 3 weeks before a crack appeared. A brown envelope, left without a note, slid through the mail slot of my tiny apartment. Inside was a flash drive. No sender, no instructions. Against my better judgment, I plugged it into my laptop. One audio file, 17 minutes, muffled voices, static between words. At first, it was nothing, just the clatter of dishes, the hum of background conversation. Then a voice I knew too well. "Maggie Dwyer. We can't trust Elise with something that valuable. You saw what happened before." Another voice. Dad's, rougher, less certain. "She's still family." Maggie cut him off sharply. "Family doesn't betray blood. Grandpa's house needs to stay with us, not with someone who'd sell it off to the highest bidder." There it was. The lie, planted neatly, watered with just enough doubt to grow, except there had never been a sale. No betrayal. Just whispered poison, spreading while I was too busy trusting. The recording ended before any names were mentioned. No direct orders, no clear conspiracy, just enough to prove what I had feared. The story had been crafted, deliberate and slow, until it hardened into truth. But it wasn't just Maggie's voice that caught my attention. In the background, faint but there, I heard Trevor Dwyer laughing softly at something. He wasn't an innocent bystander. He was part of it. And if Trevor was in on it, then the stakes weren't just sentimental. They were financial. A house tied to Grandpa's estate wasn't just a family relic. It was prime real estate in a town climbing in value every year. Whoever controlled the narrative controlled the inheritance and the future. I sat back in my chair, the room spinning, slightly. They hadn't just pushed me out of their hearts. They had pushed me out of the legacy Grandpa wanted me to protect. And the worst part was, they almost succeeded. 2 days later, I found the final piece of the puzzle tucked away in the county archives, an official copy of Grandpa's will. Neat, notarized, binding, and tucked into the fine print, almost invisible to an untrained eye, a clause: primary residence to be transferred to the family line deemed most responsible for maintaining family tradition and stability. No name, no direct inheritance, just a vague, weaponizable sentence, waiting for someone ambitious enough to twist it, someone like Maggie Dwyer. I flipped through the accompanying documents, my fingers steady even as my stomach churned. Maggie hadn't just accused me of betrayal to protect Grandpa's memory. She had done it because the house was her last chance at mattering. It wasn't about money, not really. It was about standing on that porch, hosting holiday dinners, claiming the Carter legacy as her own, and she wasn't working alone. Further, back in the file was a notarized statement, filed by Trevor Dwyer, citing concerns over my alleged history of irresponsibility and absence from family affairs. A calculated move to paint me as unstable, unreliable, someone unfit to carry on the Carter name. Trevor stood to gain too. Maggie would get the house. Trevor would secure the investments Grandpa left behind, accounts tied to the properties, i.e., deed, accounts no one had bothered to mention. The betrayal was bigger than I'd imagined. It wasn't about one house. It was about control, status, and legacy. The worst part? They hadn't even needed real evidence. Just enough whispered doubt to plant the idea, and enough silence from the rest of the family to let it grow. As I left, the courthouse, the late autumn wind sharp against my face, I knew one thing with a clarity that stunned me. They had fought to erase me, to rewrite me as the villain in their story, but they forgot one simple rule. I knew how to read the fine print, and I wasn't done yet. The first step was simple: disappear in plain sight. I stopped showing up where they could see me. No more grocery store runs at familiar places. No more lingering glances at the house on Willow Creek Lane. Instead, I enrolled in night classes. Real estate law, probate court procedures, property acquisition strategies. I sat quietly at the back of classrooms filled with eager 20-somethings, taking notes by hand like it was my only lifeline. Meanwhile, I watched and waited. Through public records, I confirmed what I had suspected. The taxes on Grandpa's house hadn't been paid in nearly 3 years. Maggie and Trevor had fought so hard to claim the home, but in their arrogance, they forgot the most basic rule. Ownership isn't just about blood, it's about paperwork. A foreclosure notice was inevitable. I started gathering funds quietly. Sold off old jewelry, picked up extra shifts, took consulting work under a different name. The money grew slowly, then steadily. Still, a shadow loomed. There was an option. One of the professors mentioned it offhand one evening, a loophole involving property liens and early bidding at pre-foreclosure auctions. It wasn't illegal, but it wasn't exactly something you bragged about at Thanksgiving, either. If I moved first, I could secure the property before it ever hit public auction. I could own it outright, and legally, before Maggie even realized it was slipping through her fingers. It would be quiet, clean, brutal, but it would mean stepping into the same world of technicalities and silent moves they had used against me. I spent a week agonizing over the decision. Every time doubt crept in, I pictured Grandpa's laugh, the way his hand ruffled my hair when I came home from college. He hadn't cared about titles or technicalities. He had cared about heart, and I remembered Mom's face that night at the door, so calm, so certain, as she erased me with a few soft-spoken words. They had made their choice. Now I was making mine. The paperwork was filed 2 days later. By the time they would realize what had happened, it would be far too late. 3 months later, the invitations went out. Celebration of Heritage, the glossy cards read, complete with a picture of Grandpa's house bathed in sunset light. It was Trevor's idea, a symbolic gesture to honor family traditions by officially passing the house into his name. Of course, the family hadn't paid the back taxes. Of course, the foreclosure process had continued quietly behind the scenes. Of course, they had no idea that the house had already changed hands. I drove by the day of the party, slowing just enough to watch the guests gather. Balloons bobbed lazily against the porch railings. Cousins I hadn't seen in years milled about the lawn, balancing paper plates piled high with potluck casseroles and store-bought pies. From across the street, I spotted Maggie, her smile broad but brittle, moving from group to group like a politician, at a fundraiser. She wore Grandpa's old watch on her wrist, the one he said he'd leave to me one day. It looked out of place, gleaming and stiff against her skin. At the edge of the yard, near the rose bushes, Robert Carter and Trevor stood locked in a quiet but heated conversation. Even from a distance, the tension was visible, the tight fists, the clipped gestures. It wasn't about family. It was about control. I stayed hidden behind the wheel, sunglasses on, window cracked just enough to catch the sound of distant laughter. At some point, Mrs. Lillian Brooks, the old neighbor, shuffled past my car. She paused, squinting through the windshield. Recognition flickered across her face, but she said nothing. Just tipped her head slightly, the barest nod, before moving on. Maybe she knew. Maybe she understood that sometimes you have to lose everything you thought mattered before you can reclaim what truly does. The sun dipped lower. Music spilled from the open windows, mixing with the sharp scent of barbecue and cut grass. The house stood proudly in the center of it all, dressed up and polished, as if it belonged to the people who had abandoned its true heart long ago. They thought they had won. They thought they were celebrating permanence. But underneath the fresh paint and the borrowed memories, the ground was already shifting, and by the time the first toast was raised, there would be no ground left to stand on. I didn't wait for the speeches to end. I parked 2 blocks away, walking the rest of the distance with my head high, papers tucked neatly inside a simple leather folder. The house glowed under the porch lights, laughter spilling down the front, steps like a waterfall too bright, too loud. As I stepped onto the front lawn, a woman at the door, maybe a second cousin, maybe a new girlfriend, caught sight of me and waved. "Deliveries around back," she called out, her voice cheerful, oblivious. For a moment, the universe held its breath. I kept walking, slow and deliberate, my heels crunching the gravel as I approached the porch. Inside, Maggie clinked her glass against Trevor's, raising a toast so loud even the neighbors probably heard her. To family, to legacy, to the next generation of Carters. She didn't notice me at first. Neither did Trevor, grinning like a boy who had just won a prize he didn't earn. It wasn't until Robert Carter turned toward the door, old instincts sharper than pride, that the party stilled. He stiffened, one hand still curled around his drink. Maggie's smile faltered. "Elise?" she croaked, the name scraping out like it hurt her throat. I stepped fully inside now, the cool air of the house wrapping around me like an old, familiar coat. Beside me, James Whitmore, calm and composed as ever, unsnapped the folder, pulling out a single heavy document. I didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't explain, just let the deed hang there between us, undeniable and final. Trevor blinked once, then twice, like a man realizing too late that the bridge under him was already burning. The silence spread across the room, brittle and absolute. For one heartbeat, everything they had built on lies and assumptions trembled, and then it began to crack, The room didn't explode. It crumbled. Maggie was the first to recover, lunging toward the folder in James's hand, her voice sharp, desperate. "This isn't valid. There's a clause. Grandpa's will. It names our side of the family." She fumbled in her purse, pulling out a crumpled copy of the old will like a magician unveiling a trick already spoiled. James didn't flinch. He calmly produced another document, stamped, signed, recorded at the county office 2 months prior. "That clause only applies if taxes and upkeep are maintained," he said, voice low, almost apologetic. They weren't. The property entered foreclosure. Ms. Carter acquired it legally through preemptive rights. A few cousins gasped softly. Someone dropped a plate. Trevor opened his mouth, searching for words, but nothing came out. Across the room, Dad, Robert Carter, set down his drink with slow, deliberate care. He didn't argue. Didn't ask questions. He just looked at me. And in that look, I saw everything he never said the night they locked the door behind me. Regret, shame, recognition. For a long moment, no one moved. The house, so carefully polished for their celebration, seemed to shrink around them, the peeling paint at the windowsill, the hairline cracks in the ceiling, all suddenly impossible to ignore. Maggie's hand dropped to her side. Trevor muttered something under his breath and turned away. The fight drained out of them faster than I expected. Maybe deep down they had always known. Maybe they understood, too late, that true ownership isn't declared by speeches or family. Trees. It's written in the quiet, patient hands that hold steady when everyone else lets go. I stood there a moment longer, letting the silence finish what my words never could. Then I turned toward the door, the folder tucked under my arm, leaving them to sort through the wreckage themselves. I was halfway down the driveway when I heard footsteps behind me. "Elise, wait!" It was Sophie, no longer the little girl clutching my hand at the dinner table, but still carrying the same flicker of hope in her voice. She caught up to me, breathless, her hands twisting the hem of her dress. "I'm sorry," she said, eyes shining. We didn't all believe them. Not really." I looked at her for a long moment. At the fear, the guilt, the fragile kindness trying to survive in a house that had taught her otherwise, I didn't say anything. Some things don't need to be forgiven out loud. From my pocket, I pulled out a small object, a tarnished brass key tied to a fraying piece of red string. Grandpa's spare key, the one he had pressed into my palm the summer I left for college. Crossed the lawn, past the sagging porch steps, and tucked the key carefully under the welcome mat, not because I expected to return. Not because they deserved it, but because some memories deserve to be left in the soil where they were born, not uprooted and dragged into new battles. Sophie watched silently, tears slipping down her cheeks. I gave her a nod, small, steady, then turned away without looking back. The night had deepened, folding the house into shadow. As I reached the street, I allowed myself one last glance over my shoulder. The house stood where it always had. But it felt different now. Hollow, unfinished, like a story missing its ending. Not every scar fades. Some simply grow quieter with time, and some goodbyes echo longer than the words themselves ever could.